Okay. Good. Welcome, everybody. I guess we're going to get started. My wife went to get a couple of handouts, but she'll be back momentarily. Let's have a word of prayer together, and then I'm going to share a bit about what we're doing together this morning. I hope you all had a good New Year's, by the way. Do you stay up real late? Stay up till New Year's? You didn't? You went to bed early?
I had to. Small kids.
Yes. I have a special tradition on New Year's. I go to bed early. That's mine. But let's pray together. Father in heaven, thank you for the opportunity to be together, and we invite your presence as we talk together. Pray that you'd help everything to come across clearly and flow smoothly. Again, we just praise you for another year of life, and we pray that we would use it to your glory and honor. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So my title here is Second Wind, A Call to Resilience. And what I want to do in our time together today is explore how we can handle difficult things that come to us in life. And there's a variety of difficult things that come to us. There's trauma that happens to us when we're a child, or events that are disconcerting as we get older. Sometimes we're just thrown a curve and we don't know how to move forward. And what I want to do is use a couple of biblical experiences. I'm going to look at the life of Moses and the life of Elijah. And I'm also going to share my own personal experience, and then things that I've learned that have helped me to continue to move forward when faced with difficulties. And I hope that something that I share will be meaningful to you and that you'll be able to apply it as well. And so, a major question is, how do we keep moving forward? Thank you, dearest. When we are confused or set adrift or feel rudderless. And the illustration that I want to use comes from Ireland last May. We visited Ireland, and in preparation for that trip, there were 4 couples together, and we were traveling throughout Ireland. And so I did some study on Irish Christianity, and I wanted to learn about Irish Christianity so I could share a couple of devotional thoughts with individuals with our small group. And early Christians in Ireland were a unique group. You can see this picture here of a small boat. It's called a curragh, ancient Irish word. And the early Irish Christians would, at least as the tradition goes, they would get in these small boats without a sail, and they would pretty much let God lead them. Like, they would get into these boats. I don't recommend this as a method of living, but they would get in these boats and they would be taken by the currents in different places, and then they would end up someplace, and then they would try to start Christianity, a new church. Basically, they were church planting. And so there was this very famous individual by the name of Columbus who left Ireland. He had a small group with him. They made their way to France, and they founded a Christian community in France. And then they made their way to Switzerland, and they founded another Christian community there. And their whole idea was, we're just going to go where God leads us. Now, sometimes life is like that, where we feel not in control of what's taking place in our experience. And that can be very unsettling for us. And so these individuals, again, interesting dynamic that they went through, but this was part of the way they lived. They went into these boats and they decided God was going to take them, and on they went. So again, I don't think that's a good way to figure out where God wants you to go. But I think the illustration is important. Their dependence on God, even when they felt adrift, even when they felt confused and perhaps rudderless. So let's talk a little bit first about resilience, and then we're going to talk a little bit about traumatic experiences, and then we'll move to some biblical characters, and then I want to share my story, and then we'll end with another biblical character. So resilience here is the process and outcome. I like that. Process and outcome. So resilience is having an experience and moving through it, and ultimately having an outcome of successfully adapting to difficult experiences. And here, again, this is from the Dictionary of Psychology, American, through mental, emotional, behavioral flexibility and adjusting to external and internal demands. So what does that mean? Resilience really is the outcome of figuring out how to handle the mental, emotional, physical experiences that come to us in life. And how do we navigate them? How do we move forward in them? Can we develop a series of steps, a repertoire, a bag of tricks, maybe we could use that expression, tools that we can use that will help us in difficult experiences? Now, people have lots of different traumatic experiences in life. Some people have them as a childhood traumatic experiences, a loss of a parent or abuse as a child. Those are clearly traumatic experiences. Trauma can happen later in life where somebody that you depend upon breaks that trust, or there can be a whole host of different traumatic events in life. And many people have some kind of traumatic event somewhere in their life, with loss of a loved one, or a betrayal, or a massive sickness and then surgery. So traumatic events give rise to different kinds of feelings, and those feelings, generally speaking, are flight, freeze, or fight. You know, those three F responses. How do we respond to them? So when we're in the fighting mode, usually there's a lot of anxiety. Your muscles are tense. Your eyes are open. In the flight mode. When you're in the fight mode, blood is pumping to the larger muscles. There's also some tenseness there as well. When you freeze, your eyes tend to get wide open. You get dilated. Your breathing becomes more shallow. And so sometimes it's just that we live in a state of stress. We have too much pressure on us, too much stress on us, and we can move into one of these different adaptations. Now, these adaptations, these responses rather, can be very helpful, obviously. There's times if a mugger is coming upon you, either fighting or running is probably a good strategy. Freezing, probably not the best strategy. But so they have an advantage. The problem is if we're living in a state like this, it's very debilitating to the body. And so how do we manage that? This is from the author Judy Herman. She says traumatic events are extraordinary. They're extraordinary events, but not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. So most of the time when something unusual happens to us, or traumatic happens to us, or strong happens to us, our body's able to respond. But a traumatic event, whether it's just continued stress in a work situation or in a home situation, it tends to overwhelm the body's defenses. So, excuse me. As I mentioned, there's a few different traumatic events, adverse childhood experiences, and a number of people have experienced that. And as I mentioned earlier, that can vary from abuse or death of a parent or some kind of negative interaction as a child. Betrayal in a marriage relationship, betrayal in an institution, if we're working at a certain place and we think the institution has a moral high ground and it turns out not to have a moral high ground. There's like an institutional betrayal, or if a leader in an institution or a ministry acts inappropriate, that also can bring about betrayal. Excuse me. And then there's a variety of life events that come to us. a number of life events. Could be a car accident. Yes.
You hit the thing.
I hit the thing. Ah, yes. One traumatic event could be when your equipment is extremely sensitive and you're trying to talk. Now you have to wait. There we go. Good deal. Thanks for telling me, dear. So, as we're thinking about this, it's important for us to recognize our two different systems. There we have our autonomic nervous system. And there's two different parts of our autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means it's not really under our control. You have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. They work together. Sympathetic has nothing to do with being sympathetic or having sympathy, but the sympathetic nervous system is the part of our nervous system that gets us going, okay? It's the active. If you're working out, like with weights, your sympathetic nervous system is running. Your parasympathetic nervous system is more your repair system. So if your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your digestion slows down. If you're under stress and your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your food's not going to digest as well. You'll have that kind of nauseous feeling in your stomach. If your autonomic system is functioning well, you begin to relax, digestion takes place. And these two systems work together. They're both important. So again, if you're running hard or you're working out with weights, that'll activate your sympathetic nervous system. But it's also important for that to be followed by the parasympathetic nervous system, which would be to calm things down. And keeping those in balance is really important. Unfortunately, in trauma, they're not in balance. The sympathetic nervous system usually overrides. And so it's important to begin to think, well, how do I get in balance? And we'll talk about a variety of different techniques for that. Cold exposure, by the way, living in Finland, cold exposure gets your sympathetic nervous system going, and a hot sauna gets your parasympathetic nervous system going. So resilience is an outcome, and that's really what I want to focus on here, is the end result, that life throws a lot of experiences at us. We interact with a lot of different things that are beyond our control, but the outcome is, how do I overcome those? How do I live with those? How do I continue to manage? What tools can I develop that can help me to be a resilient person? One thing is a mindset, and just say this here, and the mindset being, I may not like this, but I can get through it. It's just a helpful frame of reference. I may not like what's happening to me, but I know I can move forward in this. So again, resilience as an outcome. We adapt to the challenges we face, again, generally speaking. Unfortunately, at times we take adaptive strategies that are not very helpful, that tend to undermine our ultimate aim, which is to be resilient people. But we can have good adaptive strategies, and that's what we'll talk about. And part of that is behavioral flexibility, learning to adjust how we are responding to different triggers that we might be encountering. And then lastly, developing this series of repertoire steps, things that we can do. And that's going to be a major part of our middle part of our time together, is looking at concrete things that we can do. But before we do that, let's look at a biblical character. So I'd like to think about Moses for a moment. I'm not trying to psychoanalyze Moses or describe Moses' experience, but if you think about it, he had a pretty rough life, right? Exodus chapter 2. Right when he's born, what's about to occur in his experience? He's threatened with what? He's born, 3 months old, and there's a decree, right? Exodus chapter 2. Decree goes out. You need to kill all the kids. Very unsettling, pardon me?
Baby boys.
Baby boys, yeah. Very unsettling birth experience. Again, he's young enough not to really know what's going on. But his mother takes him, hides him, as we know in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, where they put them in the basket, cover it with pitch, put him in the thick reeds along the banks of the Nile River, right at the right place where Pharaoh's daughter is going to come to bathe in the river. She finds the child and she brings him home, drawing him out. His name is Moses because I drew him out of the water, verse 10 of chapter 2 of Exodus. So, kind of an interesting beginning childhood, taken from his parents, moves into he goes to with the Pharaoh's daughter, but then she looks for a nurse, and so back to his own mother. But there's this tension back and forth between his mother and Pharaoh's daughter and the palace and his home, back and forth, back and forth. Ultimately, he moves into the palace, which we're very familiar with this. And in verses 11 through 15 in the same chapter, he eventually grows, and he knows in his mind that he's called for a particular purpose. And that purpose is to free the children of Israel. He understands that God has saved him for a particular purpose. And so he begins to think, as he's walking around, he sees in verse 11 of chapter 2, it came about in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that. And when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. So fight or flight mechanism taking over. He sees what's happening. He's angry and he reacts. He kills the Egyptian, perhaps thinking in the back of his mind, this is going to be the beginning. The Hebrews are going to rally with me, or maybe he's not thinking anything. And he just goes forth and he slays the Egyptian. Verse 13, when he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, why are you striking your companion? But he said, who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me, just as you killed the Egyptian? And then Moses was afraid and said, surely this matter had become known. So, he's at a certain age. He comes out. He feels like or at least we're assuming he feels like he's entering into the beginning of his mission. But what happens? Word gets out. And he knows that he's been exposed. And so now flight takes over really strongly, and he flees. He runs, right, into the desert. I just want you to think about this for a minute. Put yourself in Moses' position. Your whole life, your mother, you're back and forth between your mom's home and the palace, and you realize that God has a purpose for you, that God saved your life, God has a purpose for you. You try to enter into your purpose, and it fails. And now the next thing is he has to flee. And he takes off. And he runs. And for me, as I thought about this, it just feels like his whole life mission is gone. And when you have an aim in life, like you want to do something, you want to make an impact in the world, you want to lead people to Christ, or you want to do a certain thing, raise your children well, whatever it is, and then all of a sudden it's gone. That's a really powerful negative experience. And how do we handle it? How do we move forward? Well, Moses flees. And we understand, he goes and he finally meets Jethro and he gets married and he settles down and he's there. This wonderful quotation from Patriarchs and Prophets 2:48. Shut in by the bulwark of the mountains, Moses was alone with God. The magnificent temples of Egypt no longer impressed his mind. In the solemn grandeur of the everlasting hills, he beheld the majesty of the Most High. Moses seemed to stand in his presence, in God's presence. Here, his pride and self-sufficiency were swept away. So here's a very intriguing thought for me. Moses is groomed to do a certain work. He's focused on the work. Something happens, a life event happens that throws him off balance, and he flees. His life work appears to be gone. But it's really part of the preparation time that God wants for him. The impressive temples in Egypt no longer awe him. The mysticism in Egypt no longer has any kind of a hold on him. And just alone in the wilderness with God, he begins to realize his own pride, his own self-sufficiency, and he begins to let it go. So here's an important lesson, I think, in terms of resilience, and that is that there are times God leads his people into wilderness times where it just feels like nothing's going right. Doors are closing, everything seems like it's not going to open up, and we just feel like I lost my life mission. And for Moses' sake, it's really because of the action he did. So think with me for a moment here. 40 years, Moses is here, and he realizes what he had done and how it had turned out. And for 40 years, there's got to be something in his mind going, I guess this is my life now. This is where I am. I lost my mission. And because of what I did, I wonder how many times he just thought about that over and over again. Well, really, God had a much bigger plan. And so in our lives, we all don't have a Moses experience where we come back and the Red Sea opens up where we see things as dramatic as that. Clearly not. But there are times in our life where it looks like all the doors are closed and we're in the wilderness. And it almost feels a bit like, oh, my usefulness is over. But that's not the case. God still has another plan. And obviously that is part of the plan with Moses. Chapter 3, he encounters the burning bush. And that's totally out of the blue. He's there, he's tending sheep, he's content, he's doing his ministry, and then all of a sudden, well, what's this burning bush? And you need to go back to Egypt. And I'm like, well, I'm not ready to go back to Egypt. Over and over and over again. And we could go through that story, how many times God tells him, hey, you need to come back, you need to go back to Egypt. And he's like, I'm not the right one. I can't talk. I can't do this. I can't do that. I don't have any skill set. Finally, God just, in chapter 4, is like, you're going to go back. Now, don't give me a hard time. That's my paraphrase. But we see the experience of Moses where it really just feels like everything's gone. I would call that a traumatic experience. You lose your family, you lose everything, you're out in the wilderness. Yeah, you get a new family, you get a new home, but you're just wondering about your life work. And I'm sure many of us, talked a little bit, some of you, about times where it just felt like, well, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And all the doors seemed to close. When we moved back from Africa, I felt like I was in this wilderness experience. Well, what next? And so we go through things like that in life, but God has a plan for it, and God wants to move us through. C.S. Lewis makes this comment in one of his books, where we often want to know what would have happened if we had done something. Anyone ever have that experience? Well, if I had done this, what would have happened? And Lewis says, to know what would have happened, nobody has ever told that. But anyone can find out what will happen. So this whole thought of, what would have happened if I had, don't even think about it. None of us know that. But all of us can find out what will happen as we make choices going forward. So let's think for a moment of another individual, and that's Elijah. And in 1 Kings chapter 17 and 18, we have Elijah's story. And chapter 17, Elijah just comes out of nowhere. Really don't know anything about his background. Just kind of, in a sense, pitches up in the Bible story. And we know in chapter 18, he confronts Ahab. It's not going to rain for 3.5 years until my word. And that is exactly what happens. It doesn't rain. It's pretty an amazing experience. And we know that Elijah's taken care of at the brook Cherith. A whole host of really interesting experiences. But then later on in chapter 18, we know that Elijah has this major confrontation with Ahab on Mount Carmel. And you go up on Mount Carmel, and all the priests of Baal are there, and it's a showdown between Baal, the god of the rain, and Yahweh, the true God. And you're familiar with the story, how in 1 Kings 18, Elijah says, well, let's see who can call fire down from heaven. And the priests of Baal, they cut themselves, they yell, they shout. Elijah mocks them. Maybe your God's sleeping. Maybe he's relieving himself, as somebody mentioned the other day. He's just not paying attention. And then Elijah kneels down. He rebuilds the altar. He pours water all over it and drenches the altar. Then he prays, and fire comes down from heaven. Then in chapter 18, he tells the king, King Ahab, that he needs to run to get into his chariot and go, because rain is about to come. And as we read in the story in 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah helps the chariot. He runs in front of the chariot a bit. But then he gets word in verse, toward the end of verse 18, in chapter 19, in chapter 19, verse 1, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed the prophets of Baal with the sword. And Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, may the gods do to me and even more if I do not make your life as the life of one of them at this time tomorrow. Verse 3 of chapter 19, and he was afraid, and he rose and ran for his life, came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. So chapter 18 is this great high point. Chapter 19, Elijah's fleeing. He had this very stressful day, kills the prophets of Baal, calls fire down from heaven, runs in front of the chariot. He's exhausted, he's tired, he gets a message, you're going to die. And all of a sudden, all of that confidence in God is gone. And that happens to us. When we're physically depleted, emotionally depleted, if we haven't been taking care of ourselves and stress has overwhelmed our body's defenses, we begin to lose sight of the power of God. And so when Elijah hears the message that I'm going to put you to death from Queen Jezebel, he runs. And he runs and he runs and, he leaves his servant. And just if you have the geography of Israel in your mind at all, Mount Carmel's kind of up in the north, and Beersheba's down in the south. Not all the way in the south, but south of Jerusalem. And so, he's made this long trek down. Now, that's where he leaves his servant. And then he keeps going further south, and he goes all the way down to Mount Sinai. But on that whole experience, angel gives him food, he rests, he wakes. And then we know the story on the mountain. He feels like his life is not worth living. Feels like his mission is over. He just had this great event, and yet he forgets. Stress can do that to us. Trauma can do that to us, where we're just so overwhelmed by the things that are happening around us that it's just hard for us to continue to function. We forget what God has done for us. And so he flees and he runs. We have this conversation, the quotation from Prophets and Kings, page 174. If under trying circumstances, men of spiritual power become discouraged, this is nothing strange or new. Well, that's a really encouraging comment. If men or women of spiritual power get discouraged, that's nothing strange or new. let all such remember that Elijah fled for his life. He asked that he might die. That is pretty discouraged. But it was when his hope was gone and his life work seemed threatened with defeat that he learned one of the most precious lessons of his life. In the hour of his greatest weakness, he learned the need and possibility of trusting God under circumstances the most forbidding. To me, that's very encouraging for us, that we face trials, we face times of tremendous difficulty, we face times of trauma, of loss. And yet, even in those most difficult and trying times, there's the need and possibility of trusting God and believing that God still has a plan. And so we see this both with Moses and Elijah, very different experiences, very different circumstances, but they both got to the place where it just felt like everything's over. Just, it's all done. So basically, we could stop right here, I suppose. We still have a little bit more time. But we could stop and say that it's Satan's work to discourage the soul, and it's Christ's work to encourage us. And Satan uses a lot of things to discourage us. He uses our own frailty, he uses experiences of life, he uses other people to discourage us. But Christ is always trying to encourage us, trying to move us forward. So I've shared with you two biblical experiences, and now, if you don't mind, I'd like to share a little bit about my own personal experience. And I was diagnosed in about 2006, official diagnosis, with a disease called primary sclerosing cholangitis. I doubt any of you have ever heard of it. It's a fairly rare liver disease. I have the unique position of probably being the only person you'll ever meet that had the disease. I mean, it's a fairly rare liver disease. And what it does, it's the primary, there's no cause for it. There's no known cause for it. Let's put it that way. Some kind of an autoimmune thing, but there's no known cause for it. Sclerosing, that means a hardening. Cholangitis, that has to do with our liver. And basically what it means is that your liver gets harder and harder and harder and harder. A little bit like if when an alcoholic drinks, their liver gets harder, it gets sclerotic. This is a similar experience, except you're not drinking, obviously. So, we have a picture here, healthy liver on one side, and then an unhealthy liver with cirrhosis. You can see, it just gets harder. And obviously these are just drawings. It doesn't really do justice to what the liver begins to look like when it gets harder. So you notice, you're probably well aware that a good healthy liver has two lobes to it. You have the right lobe, which is larger, up through here, and then you have the left lobe, which kind of comes all the way across this way. So your two lobes of your liver's your largest organ and really, really important. That's why they call it a liver, because it helps you live. At least in English, that works. And so primary sclerosing cholangitis is a disease where the liver begins to get harder, and so it stops functioning well. And what begins to happen is you get a host of different symptoms. So one of them is your body doesn't process protein. So the body begins to cannibalize protein from the muscles. So you get a lot of muscle wasting, and so your body cannibalizes protein. Somebody with primary sclerosing cholangitis, PSC, we can call it, when they wake up in the morning, their metabolism is equivalent to somebody that's been fasting for 2 days. So, I was always encouraged, you should eat something at night right before you go to bed, and I don't like eating before I go to bed. And they want you to eat protein at night before you go to bed, because when you wake up in the morning, it's comparable to be like with somebody that's been fasting for a couple of days. So it's a very draining disease in the body. It creates a lot of fatigue. Sometimes you get jaundice, and you have a higher possibility of getting liver cancer. So not only did I have primary sclerosing cholangitis, but I had 2 misdiagnoses of liver cancer. One of them was very short. They were like, oh, we think you have cancer. No, you don't. You have primary sclerosing cholangitis. So that was a pretty quick one. The other one, excuse me. Pardon me. The other diagnosis with liver cancer, they gave me actually 6 months to live. I had jaundice. I was extremely yellow. My bilirubin was around 15. And so they did an MRI of my liver. And then my doctor calls me, says, you need to come in. And I thought, that's not a good sign. I came in, and she put up my liver on the screen. She says, you see that mass over there? That is cancer. And you have liver cancer, and you have 6 months left to live. So that's a fairly traumatic event. It was a misdiagnosis, but we didn't know that for about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. We were, you're getting like ready to cry. I'm sorry, dear. For about 2 to 3 weeks, we had this mindset that, okay, I have 6 months left to live, which was really weird because I didn't feel that sick. Interestingly, one of my primary things to do was clean the garage. I figured, hey, if I'm going to die, at least I can do before then is clean the garage. We went through a lot of processes. We saw 3 different doctors. All of them confirmed the diagnosis. Then we saw a 4th doctor.
Well, you first, and before the 4th, you got anointed.
Excuse me?
You had an anointing.
Yes, we had an anointing service. We had an anointing service, prayer service. But we saw 3 different doctors. They all confirmed the diagnosis. They were all wrong. Went to the 4th doctor, and he was like, I don't want to look at anybody else's scans. I want to do my own scan. And so he does that, and my wife was there, and my sister. And so they do the scan in the morning, and then we're waiting all day to come back, and we come back in the afternoon, and the intern came in, the resident came in, and he was like, so tell me about this. And then he goes, you don't have liver cancer. And we were like, no. Yes, we do. Yes, I do. And then the doctor came in, because we thought, well, maybe he made a mistake because he's only the intern. And the physician came in, and he's like, no, you don't have cancer. This is a mistake. That mass was actually my left lobe of my liver. Instead of my left lobe being large, it was about the size of a quarter or something. And so they misread it. And he was like this. He goes through all the different dynamics. So, yes, dear?
Well, those other doctors, they said you will die, you have 6 months to live, but you're not sick enough to have a liver transplant.
Yeah. Yes. That's a very whole thing. The disease, primary sclerosing cholangitis is kind of a catch-22 disease. You continually get sicker and sicker and sicker, but you never really get sick enough to get on a list for a liver transplant. You have to be really sick. It's a very confusing situation. Exactly right. And at that time in the United States, they didn't do a lot of live donor transplants. They do now, but at that time they didn't. So then we went to visit Riverside Farm in Zambia, and my PSC flared up again. I had edema. My feet were really swollen. I was really sick. A lot of fluid. I had to get drained a couple of different times to get fluid off of me. Just exhausted all the time. And pretty much that was the diagnosis. Things just continue that way unless you get a transplant. So that moves us to a liver transplant. Eventually in the US, they've changed their strategies, and they would use live donors. In other words, if you found somebody that would donate part of their liver, you could get a transplant. The way that works is that they take 60% of the donor's liver and cut it out. So pretty much they take part of the right lobe and the left lobe. And then they take yours out and they replace it. And they put the new one in there and do whatever they do to make everything connect. And voila, you have a new liver. So my son, it sounds very easy. It was not very easy. But my son volunteered to be the donor, my youngest son. And he was really, I want to do this. I want to give you part of my liver. And I was resistant because there's a risk for him. There's a risk that something could happen and he could die. And so, you know, we're going back and forth, but he really, really wanted to, and it was clear that I needed it. We contacted a hospital in Pittsburgh called the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and their staff was absolutely fantastic. They do liver transplants on patients that have a slim chance of survival as well as a good chance of survival. They were great, totally great. We made an appointment in August, went up there, and in November, by November we had the transplant scheduled. So, but still, it's this thing with PSC is you'd feel good and then you feel sick and then you begin to feel good. If I could illustrate it this way, you know, you have a baseline when you're healthy and you feel good, and then maybe you get sick and then you feel like you're back to normal. Well, with PSC, the baseline was kind of down here somewhere, and I would get sicker and then I would feel better, thinking I was fine, but really I was down here. And the day before the surgery, I was saying, I don't really think I need this. I think I'm okay. Let's not do this, because there's all sorts of risks involved. And fortunately, very fortunately, no one listened to me, and we had the surgery. And this is a picture of my liver. You notice it looks very different than the other pictures I put up before. There is clearly no left lobe, and the right lobe is very small and hard and shrunken. And so I was sicker than I realized, and actually behind the liver was a hepatic vein, and the vein should be the size of your hair, very thin, but this vein was like the size of 2 fingers, and it was just engorged. In other words, it was ready to burst. And the surgeon was like, you know, you were just a time bomb, because if that had burst, that would have been the end of the story. So this whole experience is traumatic, right? It's a different kind of a trauma. It's not the trauma of betrayal, although I've had those in my life as well. This trauma was a trauma of sickness, a trauma of misdiagnosis. And then there was the whole, how do you recover from this? So this is a great picture of me, powered by recycled parts. I don't look very good there, but I was standing at least. So recovery took a long time. So there's one other little dimension. So being in the hospital, my recovery was choppy, up and down. Like I knew I had to sit up, so the next day I tried to sit up and then try to walk. That's an important thing to do with recovery from surgery. And I had a really difficult time for lots of different angles that I won't get into. And when they suture you, they would use staples. And so they took the staples out in 2 sections. So they took half the staples out once, and then they sent me to we weren't staying in the hospital, but we stayed, it's called a family house. It's a place where people who are having surgeries can stay. It's a refurbished hotel, and everybody there is sick for some reason. So we would stay there, and we were there, I don't know, how long you're there, 6 weeks or something like that. We would go back and forth to the hospital. And then the second time when they were taking my sutures out, the second half of the sutures, I was lying down, they took the staples out rather, and I felt moisture underneath my shirt. And I lifted up my shirt, and all of a sudden my small intestines came out. I eviscerated. And I have the rare privilege of holding my own small intestines. I'm probably the only person that you'll ever meet that has that unfortunate privilege. It's a traumatic experience. And so all these things, and I'm just free, and my wife was there. It was really hard for her too. Are you okay, dear? Obviously, she went running out of the room. Again, the staff was fantastic. They came back in, and they were like, oh, don't worry. This happens. You're in the hospital. I'll just tell you a funny incident, funny in the sense of odd. For months afterward, I would walk around like this, just in case. And I remember the first time I went to a hardware store, and as I was walking into the store, I was thinking, okay, if you eviscerate, if you burst open, what do you do? And I was like, okay, you lay on the floor and you tell them to call 911, call the hospital. I had all these tricks in mind, and that's what happens. We get these defenses, and we begin to think, how can I handle life? So my big focus first was, how do I get better physically? And so we began working on that. Well, walking to the end of the driveway was a chore. Walking to the mailbox was a chore. Walking down the street a little bit to this little tiny hill, I said, no, that's too steep, I can't go, Just walking was a chore. Eventually, you begin to move forward. In the midst of all this, I had changed my jobs. I stopped being president of OCI, I stopped being a pastor. And so there were all these things going on. And the question is, how do we deal with it? And so that's what I want to share, some of my experiences and things that I learned about how to deal with it. And one of the things that really helps me here is this quotation by Dostoevsky, who says, the best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure he never knows he's in a prison. And our thinking can be like that we can be trapped in our thinking and not realize we're in some kind of a mental prison. In other words, our thought processes can be wrong and we not realize them. We not realize that. So I want to share a number of things. Here's this book by Martin Seligman called Learned Optimism, and how to change your mind in your life. And he talks about how to become a more optimistic person. And this is actually something that we can learn. So the 3 P's of pessimism are, when an event happens to us, do we think it's pervasive? In other words, if I make a mistake, how do I respond? Do I say, oh, I always do that? That's pervasive. It's everywhere. Do I feel like there's nothing I can do to change it? Like it's personal, it's me. I'm powerless to change it. This is the way I am. And then it's permanent. So these 3 P's, a situation is pervasive, it's everywhere, I'm powerless, and it's permanent. It's going to be with me forever. This is a mindset. This is a way of thinking. And so I challenge you to begin to think about that yourself. When something happens, what's your initial reaction? Is it, oh yeah, I always do this, or he always does it? Is it, and it happens in every situation. This creates something called learned helplessness, where we feel like we can't move forward. Now he brings the opposite of these 3 P's. We have the acronym SET here, where we need to reframe our thinking and begin to look at the events that happen to us as specific, and realize that I can put forth effort to change, and therefore things are only temporary. That it's specific to this particular context. I do have the ability or the efficacy to make a difference, and therefore the circumstances are temporary. Not going to be like this forever. As I said earlier, I may not like it, but I can get through it. This isn't going to be with me forever. Now, this is an important shift of mind. It's a way of thinking. And too often we're in the others. Oh, I'm never going to get better. And there were times when I was trying to walk. I was just like, oh, I'm never going to be able to run again. I'm never going to be able to do these things again. And that's a negative way of thinking. It's not helpful at all. So let's look at some core attributes of resilience. So one of them here, as I just mentioned, is self-efficacy. The ability to make change, the ability to change ourselves, and the ability to affect change in life. There is an interesting story about this gentleman, Witold Pilecki, who was part of the Polish resistance, who intentionally got himself sent to Auschwitz. And his intention in getting sent to Auschwitz was to start a resistance movement inside Auschwitz. And he ultimately was able to get a number of people out of the concentration camp. However, what he found was that most of the people that he approached refused to participate, the vast majority, because they had this thinking that there's nothing they could do. Now, in reality, there would be times where there would be 20 or 30 prisoners and one guard. So easily they'd be able to overcome the one guard. But they had a number of different feelings. You know, we can cut them some slack. Obviously, they're very hungry. You know, they've been beaten down mentally. They're afraid of retaliation, and a whole host of things. But there were individuals that felt, no, we can make a change. So this ability, this thought, I can make a difference in my life through the power of God, through making changes, through making decisions, is a very, very key point to resilience. If we feel like we're just totally helpless, that's just this learned helplessness. Nothing I'm going to do is going to make a difference. They've done a lot of experiments with different animals. For example, there were dogs that they put, this is a long time ago, in these cages, and certain dogs, there was a sound, and then there would be a shock. And certain dogs were in a cage where if they stepped on a lever or they moved to a different part of the cage, the shock would stop. Other dogs were in a cage in which there was nothing they could do to escape it. Then they would take the dogs out of the cage and the sound would happen, and the dogs that had a way out would, when they knew a shock was going to come, they would move. The other dogs, because they had learned there's nothing they could do, would stay in the same place. Called learned helplessness. And we get in situations like that where we just feel like, oh, this is too big. There's nothing I can do to change this. That is a lie of the adversary. We are intelligent beings, and by God's grace, we can be efficacious. Another important part of resilience is self-compassion. And by this, I don't mean to be just overly indulgent in ourselves, but to cut ourselves slack. You know, rather than beating ourselves up when we don't measure up something, you know, and putting ourselves in our own mental doghouse, to be able to say, okay, well, everybody makes a mistake, or, well, I can do better next time, or I can learn, to begin to speak to ourselves the way we would speak to a friend. Oftentimes our own internal talk is much more negative than we would generally give to a friend. So to have some kind of self-compassion. And then this part here, emotional regulation, is really a key aspect of resilience, but they all work together. If we're not feeling self-efficacious, it's going to be very hard to regulate our emotions. And by regulating our emotions, I mean to realize our emotions and then not let the emotions overwhelm us. So, for example, several months, 9 months or so after our surgery, or 7 months after the surgery, we were together with my family, and I began to feel very anxious. It was with loved ones, and I just couldn't figure out what was going on. And then the same thing would happen a month later. So with a group of friends, we were in the mountains, and there was a beautiful day, the sun was out, and there were these wild ponies running around, and our friends were there. And I just was depressed and anxious, sad, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. It was just these emotions would come over me. I found out later, through talking with a friend, a physician friend, that that's part of a surgery, post-surgery trauma, that sometimes that happens. And given the fact that I eviscerated on top of it. And so just realizing that it was not unusual, or I wasn't going crazy, was very helpful. Helps to regulate the emotions. So what do I mean by emotional regulation? Well, if I'm having an anxious thought, if I'm beginning to be anxious or thinking anxious thought, I can step back and think to myself, oh, that's an anxious thought. try to put a little distance between myself and the thought. You see, what happens oftentimes is if we have an emotion like anxiety or sadness, then we get upset because I'm anxious or sad. It's called a secondary disturbance. I'm anxious, and now I'm anxious about being anxious. And so we get into this spiral. But if we can begin to regulate our emotions, begin to change our thinking, oh, that's an anxious thought. I wonder what that's about. Make a little distance between us. It actually neutralizes the physiological effects of the emotion. So certain things that are important for us to keep in mind. We have our defense mechanisms, which are usually passive and unconscious and are just really focusing on protecting self. Our more positive coping mechanisms are, they're active, they're deliberate, they're addressing our problems directly, and they tend to have long-term value for bringing about change. They're very effective long-term. Yep. We all have what's called a thinking path. This is from an organization called Corentus, where we think certain things, and then our thoughts bring forth feelings, and our feelings bring forth actions, and our actions bring forth results. Now, you can use this in a lot of different contexts. The way I want to look at it here is that when our thinking is wrong, it impacts our feelings. Like, oh, am I ever going to get better? What's going on? Am I always going to be feeling vulnerable? Or for Moses' case, I've blown it. I've missed my chance to do my calling. When we begin to feel a certain way, it's important for us to begin to stop and think, oh, what was I thinking? Now, sometimes our feelings trigger our thoughts. So there might be a reciprocal relationship here. Sometimes we'll just feel anxious without thinking about it, and then we begin thinking anxious thought. The point is, there's this, again, reciprocal aspect between these two, but we need to stop and begin to think through, okay, what's the trigger? What's happening here? What's going through my mind? So one of the ways that negative events in life impact us is through this what-if bias. What-if bias is, I don't know if you've ever done this where you're getting ready for something. Well, what if this happens? And usually what if is a negative. What if this happens? And so we get into this thinking, and we begin to think of worst case scenarios. I have a sheet that I'm going to hand out with you in a little bit. What helps work through this, oftentimes we think of a negative things, we do something else called catastrophizing, where we think the worst is going to happen. And in my experience, I began to think through, how am I going to be in a month? How am I going to be in a week? How am I going to be in a year? We can do the same thing in these circumstances. If we have a what-if bias, well, what if this negative event I'm trying to avoid does happen? What will I be like in a week? What will I be like in a year? Thinking that way helps to regulate our emotions. Okay. I'm just trying to check my time and my material. Let me share this story, and then I'm going to move along a little bit more quickly here. One of the great truths is, again, I'm talking about this because anxiety was one of the things I dealt with and I deal with, is that you really never panic to death. Nobody dies of panic. It may feel that way. It may feel like things are out of our control. But I'd like to share this story of this gentleman. His name is Felix Baumgartner, and he's Austrian. He was Austrian. He died this past summer in August, I think, 2025. He was a high jumper, like a really high jumper, and he was extreme. And in the United States, the space program, NASA, developed a suit for him, and the idea was to send him 30,000 meters, 30,000 meters? Yeah, 30,000 meters in the air in a capsule carried by a balloon. And by the way, that's like 4 times Mount Everest. And then he would jump out and he would plummet to the earth and he would break the sound barrier and then his parachute would open. Sound like a lot of fun? Ready to do that? Not really. So this is what he did. And so they made a special suit for him to do it. The problem was when he first put on the suit, he would get anxiety attacks and panic attacks. He just couldn't handle it. And then he would take it off and he would be okay. And he found out that his anxiety would build as he drove toward the facility. When he passed a certain spot, it would get to a certain level, and then the anxiety would get higher, and then it would get higher, and then he would be in the suit. And eventually, he couldn't do it. Now, the team at NASA said, okay, you're finished. They don't have any tolerance for people that can't make the grade. And so they felt like he was washed out. Fortunately, there was a doctor that began to work with him and began to help him with resilience techniques to help him get over the fear, the anxiety of being in this suit. And it was a very detailed thing. Wherever he would get to a certain point where the anxiety began to start, he would have to stop, reframe his thinking before he could move on to the next step. And ultimately, to everybody's surprise, to NASA's surprise, and everybody's surprise, he got to the point where he reframed his thinking. Instead of looking at the suit as a threat to him, he looked at the suit as a friend. It made him special. So he reframed, he gave different labels to what was going on. This is going to give me the unusual ability to break the sound barrier. Well, through a number of things. Ultimately, he went up in this balloon, jumped out of the capsule, plummeted toward Earth, broke the sound barrier, parachute opened, and he was fine. You're not going to panic to death. The key lesson from this is that there are ways of framing our thinking, making decisions in the way we think that actually changes the physical structure of our brain, which is another amazing topic, to enable us to have emotional regulation. Breathing is another really important technique, and many of you are probably, as soon as I say breathing, you all sit up and you take deep breaths because you've been shallow breathing this whole time. But breathing is a really important thing. Deep breaths where you might breathe in, hold it for a few seconds, purse your lips, and then breathe out. That helps get the parasympathetic nervous system engaged and to calm down the sympathetic nervous system. So breathing is another core attribute of resilience. And then just taking action is, again, really important because self-efficacy, the ability to do things, is vital. And what actions can we take? Well, make sure physically we're doing well, eat healthy foods, eliminate caffeine, breathing, exercise, social interpersonal relationships are essential for overcoming stress and trauma, interacting with people. Now that can be difficult when people have hurt us, but finding people that we can trust. If you experience anxiety, finding one person in the group and saying, I might begin to get anxious or I might begin to get sad, and share with one person so you have at least somebody that you can relate to. Social activities are extremely important. And of course, spirituality is vital. Prayer, communing with God, having a right picture of God, being in nature, helping other projects, all very important. So then the last point here that I want to bring out, last core attribute of resilience, is having a purpose. And this is really important, beginning to think, what am I going to do with myself? What am I going to do with my life? What kind of impact am I going to make? Even maybe it's just praying for people if we're physically not able, writing letters, communicating, being a grandparent, whatever it is. Having a purpose is vital. Viktor Frankl who wrote his book In Man's Search of Meaning after his experience in the concentration camps, said everything can be taken from man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. It's a really important point. And he's talking from being in a concentration camp, that the freedom to choose how we're going to respond is vitally important. He goes on to say, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. It's a very important point. That is not the circumstances. Circumstances can throw us for a loop, unquestionably. But as we begin to develop a repertoire of steps, this number of core attributes of resilience, having a purpose helps recenter us. So I'm grateful. Recovery takes time, but here's me and my son. This is the one that is the donor for the liver, and then my other son and my daughter. My family does these adventure racing. Actually, Finland is big in the world adventure racing. There's a big event that happens here in Finland. You may not be aware of it. But adventure racing is you go out in the wilderness and you have a map and you have to find these checkpoints and you have a compass. You can't use GPS or anything. And it takes biking, running, trekking, paddling, sometimes swimming, things like that. And so we did an adventure race in March. We came in first in our group. Not bad for an old man who had a liver transplant. We came in actually fourth or fifth out of 50, so it was a really good experience. But it took time to get there. I'm way slower than they are. But moving forward gives us resilience. Resilience is an outcome. Not too long ago, my granddaughter, who's just turned 13, wanted to climb this mountain in California. It's called Half Dome, thank you. And this is a very vertical, straight up. Most of the time, these cables are on stanchions, and there are these boards, and you kind of walk up it. At the time of year we went, the cables were down on the ground, so you had to pick the cable up and move up it. And the other rock below it, we got to there first. It was about a 8-mile hike in, 5,000 feet elevation gain, 2,000 meter elevation gain, a little less than that. And we get there, and I began looking at this upward thing, and I thought, what in the world are we thinking? And then I thought, don't think, just do. Don't think, just climb. And changed my mind frame, and then up we went. So I just want to end quickly with this story of Paul, Philippians chapter 1, where Paul, toward the end of his life, is in prison. And in Philippians, and he feels like his ministry is at an end. Again, he is at the end of his life. But in Philippians chapter 1, some beautiful thoughts here. In verse 12, he says, now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, as my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has been made known through the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else. So he goes on here, and he shares with the Philippians how that Christ is being proclaimed no matter what's happening. He's in prison, but it really is furthering the work of the gospel. He feels like everything's cut off, but God still has a plan for him. There is a lesson for us in the experience of Paul's, for it reveals God's way of working. The Lord can bring victory out of that which may seem to us frustration and defeat. Don't forget that. Frustration and defeat, God can bring victory. We are in danger of forgetting God, of looking at the things which are seen instead of by holding by the eyes of faith the things which are unseen. If he sees to cut off our usefulness in some line, we mourn, not stopping to think that God may be working for our good. So just like with Moses and like Elijah, like with Paul, like with myself and you in your own life, that there are times where it looks like we've hit this dead end, but it's not. God still has a plan. He wants us to live lives of resilience, continuing to move forward as he deems best, as he sees best for us. So I'm going to end there. I do have 2 handouts for you.
You still have 30 minutes.
Pardon me?
You still have 30 minutes.
I still have 2 minutes.
30.
No, I'm supposed to go to...
It says here, it says 11:45. Right here, 10 to 11:45.
What did I look at today that said 10:15? All right, so again, sorry for my misunderstanding of the time. I went through a few things quicker than I normally would have. But let's look at these 2 sheets, if you don't mind. Spend a couple of minutes on this, and then I have just a few more thoughts to share. And let's look at the one decatastrophizing first. So remember we talked about emotional regulation as being a key factor in resilience. Now, our emotions spring up from a variety of different circumstances. If I can use this illustration for a minute, if we think of my arm here as your spinal cord, and then think of the palm as the amygdala, which is almond-like structures in the center of the brain that are connected with emotion. And then if I were to make a fist, and you have this frontal part here, we can call that the prefrontal cortex, this first part of the brain. And in this part of the brain is where we make decisions. This is where the higher centers of the brain are. So the spinal cord connects to our entire body, the amygdala, and then the prefrontal cortex. It used to be thought that these 3 structures represented an evolutionary development of the brain. Most neuroscientists don't believe that anymore, which is great because we don't believe in evolution anyway. So, but they do represent different parts of brain activity. So it's very clear that the frontal part of the lobe, the prefrontal cortex, is more involved in decisions, where the amygdala is more the emotional center. And of course, it connects through the nervous system to the entire body. So I have a friend that is deathly afraid of spiders. And so if she were to see a spider, the emotion, the amygdala, is going to jump in and it's going to run down through the nervous system, and the body's going to feel this emotion. So in emotional regulation, we want to get the prefrontal cortex involved and to begin to think things differently. So instead of thinking, oh, a spider, or those that don't like snakes, oh, a snake, we could think, oh, a snake, how interesting. Or, oh, a spider, how interesting. Begin to reframe what's going on in our prefrontal cortex so that we can make decisions. And so on this handout on decatastrophizing, you have those first 2 words, cognitive distortions. This refers to wrong ways of thinking. And so remember that chart that I had up, the thinking path, where we had thinking, feeling, actions, and results. Cognitive distortions are wrong ways of thinking. And so cognitive distortions alter the way we perceive the world. So if my thinking is not calibrated correctly, it'll make us see things in a way that is not in tune with reality. Where this becomes really important is that we begin to discount the positive and we begin to accent the negative, and just really, all the time. So we pretty much see ourselves more or less, making us see things in a way that is not in tune with reality. We might filter out the positive, see ourselves as much more or less in control of things than we actually are, or blow the bad decisions out of proportion. So the way to use this handout is if you have a major worry, whatever it might be, missing the plane, or, right? Yeah, so we have this kind of thing all the time. I'm the kind of person, I get to the airport, check in, walk through, walk on the plane, sit down, and my wife wants to be at the airport 2 hours before the plane's gonna leave. Something like that. You like that?
Yeah.
Oh, brother.
There's a lot of people that like it. You just don't understand.
I don't understand. You're right. I don't understand. Okay, so hold on. So there's just a detail. I'm just giving you a worry here. We could put in any different kind of worry, whatever the worry is. Then the idea is to begin to think, okay, what's the worst case scenario? If I don't get there in time, I might miss my plane, or I might miss the bus. Okay, then what? What's it going to be like? Worst case scenario, most likely scenario. Then try to think through, well, what are the percentages? And then begin to think, okay, so what would happen if? And do both of those. It's just a tool to help with worry. Now, whatever time we get to the airport is totally fine. People's
You
comfort.
heard that, right? I should have recorded you.
Yeah, you should have. The big question is, how do we navigate the emotions that go along with it? And the emotional regulation starts in a couple of different ways. It starts with the deep breathing, and we shared a little earlier. You can emotionally regulate through walking, being in nature, prayer, singing, talking to someone. There's a lot of different techniques we can use to regulate our emotions, but that again helps calm things down. When we're stressed, actually it's very interesting, when we are in a lot of stress, our visual field, our field of vision actually narrows, and we physically don't see as wide as we normally would. Mentally, it also shuts down options that are open to us. So the high stress, not just talking about stress of life, but when we're really engaged in stress, when our sympathetic nervous system is really overworked, it can prohibit us from seeing other solutions that we might otherwise see. So this other sheet is a little bit longer, and the aim of it is to help you see triggers in your life in which stress arises. And so there's a chart on the second page, and in the first column you would just jot down events that bring stress to you, and then you would, in the next two columns, you would note down your physical and emotional symptoms. So now this is a really important thing, and what I'd like to stress here is, or I'd like to underscore, is that oftentimes we might be in a stressful situation and not really know it. Now, Seventh-day Adventists talk a lot about our body being the temple of God, but we're often pathetically unaware or not in tune with what's going on in our system. As a leadership coach, I've coached individuals, and I would ask them, as we're coaching, describe your physical position for me. Like, how are you sitting? Are you hunched up? Are you tense? And I would ask them, what are you feeling? What do your shoulders feel like? If they were having a particular problem, I would ask, well, where do you feel that? If somebody would say, well, I feel angry. Well, where do you feel angry? Well, I feel it in my chest, or I feel it in my stomach, or I feel it in my shoulders. The more in tune we are with how our body's feeling, that can also help us to recognize when we're in stress. Too often we get into stress and we stay in the stressful situation and our body goes through these pains, and then eventually we can't ignore what the body's feeling, and it really communicates to us. But if we begin to pay attention to what's going on in our body, check our shoulders, am I anxious someplace? It could also be a pointer to a stressful experience. So the chart here on the second page is to kind of help you work through those things, and then to become aware of them. Whenever I have this circumstance, I begin to feel this way. I'm going to start noticing when I feel this way, maybe there's another trigger engaged. And so then we want to think of how we can handle it. What are the decisions we can make? What from our repertoire steps of resilience or coping mechanisms can we put in place? And so that's in the third page here. So, when I'm given a mountain of work at work and I'm beginning to feel stressed, what can I do? What can I do? Well, I can take a walk, prioritize tasks, delegate tasks, communicate with my boss, do something. to be efficacious, to have the ability to be able to act. So hopefully this handout here will also be helpful for you in recognizing when you are in stress and then developing ways in which you can move forward in greater resilience as well. So studies have shown that more than 60%, sometimes almost 90%, of trauma victims undergo what's called post-traumatic growth. And people talk a lot about post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is the experience that happens after a stressful event. What doesn't get as much news or airtime is post-traumatic growth. And most people, when they go through a traumatic experience, like I've gone through and each one of you have gone through in a different way, can actually have a growth from it that we can mature. And we saw that both with Paul and with Moses and with Elijah's experience as well, that there was something else for them afterward. So, and this is from the book, The Power of Bad, How Negativity Rules Us and How We Can Rule It. Really interesting, very easy read book about how we look for, how we're more attuned to negative. We shared this the other day in the conflict seminar, that in relationships, one negative comment, it will take 5 positive comments to outweigh one negative comment. And so particularly in parental situations, if a parent is always like, no, don't do this, no, don't do this, don't do this, it's communicating a negative where there needs to be lots of other affirmation and positives to outweigh that. It's a very, very interesting book. So I'd like to just go back here with this, the Irish in the Curraghs. And sometimes in our lives, it feels like we have no rudder and no sail. Maybe we don't have any personal direction in life. Maybe a job has closed for us and we can't see what the next task is. Maybe we just don't have the energy to be involved in propelling ourselves forward, so we have no self-propulsion. There are times in our experience where we just need to let God lead, where we just need to rest in God, trust in God, and understand He's going to lead. Of course, we also need to move with the variety of resilience techniques that I shared with you. So in times of transition, we can also often feel like we're wandering. Times of transition, we're moving to a new place, or we've lost a job, or we're entering into retirement, or we're leaving high school and we're going to go to a different school, or whatever it is, or we're graduating from college. These are moments when we need to travel by faith. Trust the wind of the Spirit to bring you to a desired harbor, just like those early Irish did. Now, I want to share on my desk at home, I have a piece of paper that has these questions that I just want to share with you. So, a little piece of paper, I wrote these down, and when I'm in a point of question, I have a series of questions. When I'm in a point of perplexity, I have a series of questions that I look to help give me guidance. The first here is, what can I decide or do? In other words, is there a decision I need to make, or is there an action that I can take now that will create the greatest value? For me, this is a really clarifying question. You know, instead of just wasting my time, what can I decide, what can I choose, or what can I actually do that's going to create value? That's important. We talked earlier about purpose, and we want to create value in this world. So having this question, what can I do right now, or what can I decide that's going to create value? Another question that helped me in times of transition is, how does I'm feeling, thinking, or acting support what I aspire to be? So now that presupposes that we know what kind of person we aspire to be. Okay? That if we, I want to be a person of integrity, I want to be a person of spirituality, I want to be a person of influence. If I'm clear what kind of person I want to be, and then I can ask this question, is what I'm feeling, thinking, or doing supporting that? And if it's not, where do I need to make a change? And then in this question here, last question, what do I know about my ability to grow and become better? This helps me look back at my own experiences and realize that God has taken me through a variety of experiences and can bring me forward. And then lastly, how can I use my gifts and experiences to bring greater value? So ending both questions with value, how can I move forward toward value? But what do I know about my life? What do I know about my personality? What do I know about my experiences that can help me to move forward? So these are questions, again, I just have them on my desk, and occasionally there's a period of time where I'll just take it up and like, okay, what's next? What should I be doing? What am I thinking about? Questions for me that I thought I would share with you as well.